Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. The Honourable Dr. Hendy Cowan, AO, Chancellor, Edith Cowan University. Professor Arshad Amari, Acting Vice-Chancellor, Edith Cowan University. Professor Colleen Haywood, AM, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Equity and Indigenous, Edith Cowan University. Distinguished guests all. I'd like to thank May for that welcome to country and to say how delighted I am that her son Barry will have his boat go with the little girl overseas and they'll see his art. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's with great pleasure that I'm here this morning for the 7th Annual Edith Cowan Memorial Lecture, and I thank the University for the invitation. Edith Cowan was clearly a giant of Western Australia's history. In all the first we celebrate on International Women's Day, Edith Cowan is a standout as the first woman to prove her capability as a parliamentary representative. She is remembered through a university named after her, an electorate named after her, her image and signature on the $50 note, and a clock memorial erected to her on the traffic island at the entrance to Kings Park. She wrought many social reforms that have had a positive impact on Australian women and Australian society. But she also set an example by overcoming seemingly insurmountable challenges in order to make a mark. Her mother died when Edith was 7. It's hard to imagine the impact of a little girl of a mother dying in childbirth, the seeming abandonment by her mother, the grief at home, and the loss of family life when the tragedy had her sent from the pastoral station to boarding school in Perth. There was perhaps an even greater hurdle to come 8 years later when she was just 14. Her father, a well-to-do pastoralist and explorer, murdered his second wife and was executed. He was hanged at Perth Jail in 1876, a decade before the gallows at Fremantle Prison came into use in 1889. So what a horror and humiliation for teenage Edith. Her father, Kenneth Brown, was tried 3 times, with details of how her father shot his wife set out in the press. And what a come down from having a father of high status in the young colony, running a sheep station and thoroughbred racecourse stud, and gaining renown for his exploration beyond the station. She had also been born into a family of standing through her mother. Her mother's father was an Anglican churchman who had been appointed by the British government to be the colonial chaplain for the Swan River colony in 1829. I'm a great believer in accepting hurdles and challenges and recognising how challenges strengthen us. But young Edith was presented with challenges that would defeat many. Demonstrating extraordinary resilience and determination, she didn't just rise above them, but soared above them to ring in such positive changes for social reform and for women particularly. As an interesting aside, Annabel Crabb's book says that while he was helping her with door knocking for her election campaign, her husband James was told by an earnest lady that this Mrs. Cowan was neglecting her children, the youngest of whom was by then 30. What an example Edith Cowan gives us of meeting challenges and triumphing over them. I often think women of my generation are lucky, and the younger generation even more so. I was encouraged by my parents to go to university and I studied science, and along the way changed from wanting to major in pharmacology to a double major in maths. The maths degree was a great training in logic, and once I started work with the WA Treasury, I recognised the need for a qualification more related to my work and commenced part-time study for a degree in economics. When I first started work, female graduates were paid less than male graduates. It wasn't actually a huge difference, and it was being phased out. I faced some discrimination, but mainly from people who didn't know me. Attitudes were slowly changing. I actually found there was quite a change in my own view when there were female ministers appointed, and I felt that there was much more acceptability of females then. But by the time I'd reached CEO or Deputy CEO level, and I think I was also able to make a difference for other women by role modelling and encouragement. When I started in Treasury in 1971, it looked like promotion would be impossible because all the jobs above me were filled. However, people left and I worked hard, and within 5 years I was Chief Research Officer and another 5 Head Director of Treasury's Financial and Economic Policy Division. The work was complex and interesting, and I may have stayed longer than the 17 years had it not been for the then Under-Treasurer. He was retiring and he suggested that I needed to broaden my experience. I don't know why he didn't tell me while he was still there, but he told me when he retired. Along the way, I gave birth to two wonderful boys, the first when I was in Treasury and the second towards the end of my 4 years as Deputy Director General of Transport. By the time the second one arrived, I took only 3 months maternity leave, as I was by this time Acting Director General of the Department of Transport, and I was also chairing the government's waterfront reform working group, and I had to have meetings on that while I was on maternity leave. And those of you who've had children will know it's not easy. You've got to get the baby ready every time you do things, so it was easier to go back to work really and get a nanny. I'd been back from maternity leave about 15 months when I was asked to take on the position of CEO of Fremantle Ports on an acting basis. The job was later advertised and I was appointed. Going there on an acting basis was quite a career risk for me at the time because I didn't have any port operational experience, and Fremantle Ports incurred an underlying loss of 30 million the year before I went there and an actual loss of 70 million. And what Treasury did is give us an overdraft, so they had to be repaid. Hence, lots of change was required to restore profitability. There were also about 20 industrial awards and 14 unions, and the port hadn't started to grapple with waterfront reform, which was then in its infancy around Australia. But as well as a risk and a challenge, I saw it as a very worthwhile opportunity to help exporters, which after my time in Treasury I saw as very important, and also to restore the reputation and profitability of Fremantle Ports, which I saw as one of the state's great trading enterprises. And working with a wonderful team, that's what we did, including restoring profitability, paying government dividends and tax equivalents, becoming commercialised and using the Australian Business Excellence Framework to ensure we were systematic in our change process. So as a team, we made huge changes. I was breaking new ground, and when I left Fremantle Ports after 17 years, I remained the only female CEO of a port in Australia and one of less than a handful in the world. And I should say that after 17 years as CEO, I was the longest staying CEO of any port in Australia, in truth. But I believed I'd worked hard to learn and innovate in an industry, and I'd been accepted. And that was indicated by the fact that I was Vice President and then President of our National Association, Ports Australia, and also the inaugural inductee in the Lloyd's List Shipping and Transport Hall of Fame in 2007. So I was pretty proud to be the inaugural inductee in an industry that was so male-dominated. After 17 years as Fremantle Ports CEO, I went to London, and again I was the first female Agent General from any Australian states, and now the first female governor after a line of 31 male governors. And then between returning home from London, where the Agent General is based, and taking up my current role, I had a challenging but very enjoyable career as a director of a number of different commercial boards and charities. In looking at the parallels with Edith Cowan, I think it would have been because of women like her that I was able to pursue a non-traditional career path. Well, I know that the expectation of some of the people and some of the staff at Fremantle Ports when I went there was that I wouldn't be able to stay the distance. And I guess that wasn't helped by the fact that I had permed hair, which was curly, and wore frilly dresses. But I had actually inherited a determined streak, and I'd previously chaired a steering committee on waterfront reform and also on change management, both of which were very helpful. In terms of my career learnings, it was apparent to me that we needed to start with a focus on our delivering for our customers. We also progressed strategic planning and waterfront reform, including the elimination of practices such as demarcation, and we had to do that in a very consultative manner. Turning to some of my career learnings, most of them relate to my 17 years as CEO of Fremantle Ports. But top of the list is the importance of accepting opportunities. I should add that women often lack confidence to apply for jobs, feeling that they need to satisfy all the selection criteria before applying for a job. So I think we can help other women by encouraging them to apply for jobs and giving them confidence. Second is the importance of persisting and being determined. As part of our change process at Fremantle Ports, we use the Australian Business Excellence Framework. And what I liked about the Business Excellence Framework was the fact that it meant that you needed to improve on a broad front. You couldn't just focus on customers, but you needed to also focus on your staff or your own people, on leadership, on strategy, information and knowledge, processes, success and sustainability. So it wasn't a narrow basis, and you were trying to improve on all of these. We persisted in using the framework as part of our improvement journey for many years. In fact, I think it would have been about 15 years. And I was proud when in 2007 Fremantle Ports was judged to have reached the top, which is the Gold Award level. And in that year we also received the Australian Business Excellence Medal for the best organisation in Australia in terms of business excellence. So the persistence for many years with the Australian Business Excellence Framework meant that we achieved the goal. My third learning is the importance of strategic planning. When I got to Fremantle Port, they didn't have a strategic plan, and I find it very hard then, but you've got to not only know and agree with your team what you want to achieve, but you need to measure how you're going against it, you need to regularly review how you're going, and you need to review the plan at least every 3 years. So you've got to make the strategic plan a document you use. Fourth, I had a learning about setting out my expectation of our leaders. At one stage I remember I was sitting in the office and being a bit disappointed about some of our leaders and saying, why aren't they resolving conflicts in their team? Why aren't they actually getting their team behind our strategic plan? And then I realised that they had their job descriptions, but I hadn't set out my own expectation of our leaders. So I spent a while working with them to agree the expectations in a consultative way. And, because I realised that that needed to be done. And one day at one of our strategic planning sessions, I was briefing our leaders on what the expectations were of them. And one of them put up their hand. And so I said to him, yes, what is it you want? He said, well, I can't understand why you're telling me this because I'm not a leader. And I said to him, oh, well, what's your title? And he said, team leader. and I thought, so I then realised that you not only had to set out your leadership expectations, but you needed to tell people they were leaders. So in our leadership model, we even told the people at the bottom of the organisation that they were leaders because they had to be leaders in resolving any customer issues. So everyone has leadership aspects, but it was quite a learning process for me when I realised I hadn't actually developed a leadership model. My next learning was the importance of organisational values and the clarity provided through discussing and agreeing organisational values. And these included values such as honesty, continuous improvement, valuing both customers and other staff, and care for the environment. People need to have values to know how to show initiative in their job. If we hadn't said that customers were valuable, they may not have realised we wanted to resolve any customer issues quickly. And it's also important that they can then speak to their peers about not showing values. I should say, the port was a bit of a difficult environment. When I first went there, we had to, first of all, speak about expunging behaviours we didn't want. And those behaviours included stealing for the employer, that we want to expunge that, and we wanted to expunge violence as a way of solving any problems. So before we got to values, we had to speak about behaviours we didn't want. Another important learning I've had is the need to have confidence and to believe you're going to succeed. Otherwise, you're giving up even before you start. So if I went to any job and thought I wasn't going to succeed, how good would I be in that job? Not at all. So Lou Tice said this: if you believe you're going to succeed and you come to obstacles, you'll look for ways around or under them. But if you believe you're going to fail, you'll give up at the first sign of an obstacle. So finally, I would also mention the need to aim high. And this was my school motto and is so important. And I like Michelangelo's saying on this, it's one of my favourites. The greatest danger for most of us is not that we aim too high and we miss it, but that we aim too low and we reach it. I would also mention that what I learnt from my grandmother, namely the importance of being determined and resilient. I always think it's the difficulties in life which show what you're made of, because it's easy to be strong when things are going well. The philosophy of continuing to improve is one which is very important for both an individual and an organisation. And as part of my continual improvement, I've got a commitment to lifelong learning. This has involved taking challenges in my work to take me out of my comfort zone, and I've had many of those, also some formal courses and considerable reading on leadership and management. I particularly like Stephen Covey's 8 principles, 5 of which I would particularly mention today. Seek first to understand before being understood, so listen. Begin with the end in mind. Put first things first, i.e. prioritise. Sharpen the saw, that is, continue to renew yourself and improve. And communicate. This was really his 8th principle, which he added later. But he did reflect, as I do, that that's critically important in leadership. As I reflect on the importance of continued learning, I want to take a minute to reflect on some outstanding educators in an area where more is needed. The latest Closing the Gap report released last month on the 11th of February again points to the sadly low rate of literacy and numeracy in our Aboriginal communities. Among the women we honour today must be those women, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, who have dedicated themselves to advancement of our Aboriginal people through learning. Of course, right here in Colleen Haywood AM, we have a shining example of the power of education. A university professor and inducted into the WA Department of Education Hall of Fame for Achievement in Aboriginal Education, Professor Haywood heads ECU's Curran Curl Catagen Centre. She was an inaugural director of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative body, the National Congress, and was the 2008 National NAIDOC Aboriginal Person of the Year. She has lived by her own dictum to Indigenous people. Set your sights high and have a go. We can all be nervous about things that are different, but you'll never know unless you give it a go. So this is very similar to my own learning about taking opportunities and believing in yourself. Colleen's father was a trailblazer before her, ECU's first Indigenous Australian graduate, the first formally trained Aboriginal teacher in WA and the first Aboriginal principal. The first female Aboriginal teacher in WA, May OBrien, was born around Laverton and sent to the Mount Margaret mission when she was 5. There was her challenge in missing her mother and the life of her culture. But she excelled, and so she was sent to Perth for secondary schooling. That itself was another challenge, given she was older at 17 than the other students, and she also had to come at first failing an IQ test. But she took it upon herself to appeal to the top and was accepted, doing well and returning to teach at the mission and to encourage generations of students. Her hard work, enthusiasm and role modelling made an impact on bridging the gap between culture and creating opportunities for Aboriginal people. She helped create Aboriginal committees of education around the state and was a foundation member of the National Aboriginal Education Committee. She was appointed Superintendent of Aboriginal Education, serving a total of 34 years in the education system before retiring to write bilingual children's books. She is an ambassador for numeracy and literacy and has long campaigned for social justice and equality for Aboriginal people. Her advice is to use words instead of fists. May OBrien has achieved so much while still grappling with the injustice she felt about being taken from home and sent to the mission. And she said, "Not having parents who cared for you and being at the mission with 30 other girls, it was quite lonely at times. Not being able to talk to someone and call someone your own." So I very much empathise with those of the stolen generation. It would have been very difficult for them and required huge strength of character to succeed. Today we can also reflect on their successes. And of course there are many other examples of women forging ahead to create today's world. Just think, all 4 category winners as Australians of the Year for 2015 were women. However, in celebrating the achievements of women, I wanted to end with my concern that we, men and women working together, still have work to do. When we have a situation where women are graduating in a higher proportion than men and make up 48.5% of the Australian workforce, but only hold 1 in 4 of the positions in the top 3 levels of management, there is something that isn't working. I hope I've given some food for thought in my comments today, and I would be pleased to answer questions. Thank you.